did get told off after my comment afterwards in recognition that I was coaching, or I did some coaching, but I'm definitely not at the goal face now to qualify. That not get told off anymore. To set up the next couple of hours, and I appreciate, to be fair, at one point I thought I had the graveyard shift the last session, and then I realised Dick was up at the end, so hopefully I'll give you a bit of a G-up. But really, what I'd like to do for the next couple of hours is start a conversation, continue a conversation on the John set with the guy this morning around the hero's journey, committing to an uncertain future, and recognising, as I know you all do on a daily basis, recognise that there are obviously significant others, other expertise, other knowledge, other people, fundamentally, that might be required or important along or through that journey. And I don't see that overly philosophically. My role currently in the EIS, if I boil it down in the simplest possible terms, is to help our heads of performance support in every Olympic and Paralympic sport do just that, connect our expertise, our knowledge, either internally in teams or externally in this ever sort of vast, growing system that we create to you guys, to the coaches and athletes. But the intention of the next couple of hours is really for me to share some thoughts. I don't stand here genuinely as an expert in this space. I stand here as somebody that's sort of holding the reins for the organisation I work for and some of the people that I represent. And I'm really curious, actually, as we sort of work through the next couple of hours, just to hear how some of the things that I put on the table land, what your experiences are of them, and most importantly, to start that conversation between yourselves. Because I think it's probably at times, I understand this, probably one of the most frustrating bits of the coaching gig, the coaching app. We were talking about it earlier on. How do I get these people that are paid to do this, to do what needs to be done? Not always straightforward. John touched on this earlier on. I think this has been touched on a lot through the last couple of days. The ultimate challenge, I guess, we've got at the performance end, but clearly again from what I've heard today through the pathway, is we're committing to something that is broadly uncertain and very unpredictable. And I think that creates some inherent challenges when we start talking about what we are working together on, what matters. We'll get to that in a second. But when we talk about not understanding the future, when we talk about low degrees of certainty or accuracy in being able to predict the future, and a world where we constantly are, from an objective perspective, trying to understand, objectify, and keep pushing boundaries with all the right intentions, inherently that creates some challenge. I'm sure it creates a lot of challenge in the coaching space, and understanding what we need when, and actually just accepting as human beings. And as coaches, I know you're helping people with this all the time, but fundamentally, we don't know. And it's a horrible thing when you've spent copious amount of your life and a lot of cash to become very, very qualified in a very specific area, to start a conversation where you hear, we don't know. Often the perception we sell, I'm not sure if this is true across the world, but it's something I'm always putting myself up on and other friends and colleagues, that we don't sell utopia into the performance vision around what we know and specifically in detail how we're going to do it. Often we've been told through sort of the history of planning, the linear nature of it means that we get high degrees of certainty around even things as complex as adaptation, that we can predict it in blocks and know exactly what's going to happen at the end of each training block in detail at an individual level. Now, I'm not saying I'm anywhere near the 50th centile of S&C coaches in the world, that's for sure. But early on in my career, I realised I do this programme, spend a lot of time thinking about it, look great on a piece of paper, got the coach buy-in, we're all good. Training intervention, and the changes I was expecting to happen probably weren't what I committed to the coach with. These individual nuances that clearly you're working with every day, they're not always that palatable from the backgrounds, the educational backgrounds, the truth in many ways, that we're told in disciplines or ologies early on. So how do we commit to an uncertain future, in part when we're coming from backgrounds that value different types of knowledge and fundamentally experientially aren't connected. And I think that's part of the challenge we've got. If I was going to boil it down again in my simple brain to what I think two of the big challenges we've got in working together on the things that matter are, is the tension between things, structures, solid things that exist. Yeah, I put this up for John. This is, for those of you who don't know, this is the Severn Crossing that connects England to Wales. It's an emotional connection across that. Without that, relations between England and Wales would be much, much worse than they are. We need structural things to connect people, to connect us. Of course we do. We need investment into those things, and there's a level of complicatedness and predictability about how we might go about doing that. And of course we need that. We need that in everyday life just to function, to stay connected. But then we come to this lot, the people bit, and it's never straightforward, is it? It's always unpredictable. We are our own islands, we have our own motives, we see the current reality differently at times, we perceive what is or isn't important differently, we interpret the values, as I said before, we'll talk about them more later on, different knowledge types to different degrees, and our experiences are fundamentally different. We're not the same people. And inherently, if we don't pay attention to the human element of what we're really trying to achieve with the ologists, with the experts, and vice versa, right? Then we often end up in a place where we don't understand what matters, it's difficult to connect, we can't solve problems that quickly, and probably worst case, and I've definitely operated in a few teams like this and probably caused those problems, people just end up really pissed off. We don't get the best out of the resources available on behalf of the athlete. You know, one of the questions that one of my mentors often prompts me with if I just need to have a little outlet about something, can you tell me which relationships are currently failing the athletes inside the system? A powerful question for us to think about the responsibility we have together to stay connected on behalf of athletes' ambitions and dreams. I'm just going to pause there. I appreciate that was a bit of an opening monologue, but how's that landed for people? Is there, I genuinely shoot you down if people disagree or see it differently. Be interested in any initial thoughts. There's it. Go on.
Well, I think your opening position on letting go of certainty and that, the comfort blanket that certainty provides, and for all that's modern science has brought us into scientific method. Obviously, it seeks to find truth in it, and that's framed in a certain way. Yet the reality of the world that you're talking about, where people are operating in, it's deeply complex. Things are connected, but it's hard to figure out the cause and effect if you can ever do that at all. So, what possibilities might be opened by letting go of certainty, predictability, and I can share quite personally the British Olympic and Paralympic system has probably been in a place in time where certainty's kind of been the goal that everyone's searching for. If we can predict this, we can easily plot the steps to get there. You change the paradigm if you start letting go of certainty.
And probably going back to what you talked about earlier on, it's not necessarily either or, right? But the fact that maybe we spend a lot of time thinking about structure, control, might be the other side of the story.
Hold it lightly, hold certainty lightly.
Any other initial thoughts? Anyone agree? Add anything at this point?
This makes me think, because the structure and the connection you need with your governing bodies and everybody else. But on the right, you've got the people. And to me, links with something that somebody said earlier about how much we as coaches spend time measuring things and performance analysis versus having the confidence to go with our gut feeling, which is the less measurable. And this is about gut feeling and dealing with people, because you can't measure them as well as you can output like fitness scores.
Yeah.
So I'm interested to see where you take it next.
Yeah. And definitely down that track. I think we'll come on to that later on, sort of the value of knowledge and how that might be making you at times feel as coaches. We'll come on to that. So anything else at this point?
I'll offer something brief. I was really privileged to be involved in a project that was kind of lasted over about a 12 to 18 month period where we were able to work as a small team with everyone in the organisation that were working together at times to support athletes. And as part of that, we really tried to understand the athlete's experience. Coming on to the very last thing that you said that really hit home. And often the impactful and developmental and rich experiences that they were having were directly related to wonderful collaboration. And on the flip side, a lot of the problems that the sport faced were because there were tensions, there was fracture, there was disconnect, there was an inability to work together. And to understand that from their perspective over a longitudinal period was hugely impactful on my thinking and my work today. So I think envisage what you're about to speak about is going to be really valuable because I know you've done so much of this today.
I think as well, hold on to that when we open the conversation, it would be really cool to find more about what you learned through that. Also. So I'm going to start with a bit of management speak. Some of the challenges and opportunities we might have in, and probably lands on John's point, set a direction. We might describe it as aspirational goal setting, we might describe it as performance objectives, we might describe it as lots of different things, but in any form of achieving anything, clearly, I'm not going to labour this one, you're the experts in this space, we've got to set direction. Do we know where we're going? It gets difficult to connect anybody to anything if we don't really know what we're here for. I think the challenge with this, though, with this whole piece, with this whole effort, and I think you just hit on this as well, is that we lead a lot of setting direction with logic, certainly at certain levels or in certain approaches. And when others get involved, it's normally logic that lands first. So, performance objectives, medals, and I won't come back around that one again because I think that was touched on earlier on. And I'm not saying it's wrong, and it's in large part what we're here for, but are we really clear about what it is we're trying to achieve? Now, I don't use this quote lightly, but could we specifically, in every environment or athlete IEP or aspiration that we've got between federations and NGBs to move things forward, be really clear about what we're trying to achieve and what it's going to take? Could we say it in 3 sentences? Could we visibly walk into a conversation, pool side or track side, and know in that moment when the coach is talking to the athlete, I know pretty much this is the direction of travel. In broad bracket stroke, this is what's trying to be achieved. And I'm not saying that lightly or pushing it all back to you guys on this. This is a collective commitment piece. The other thing I've learned more recently, actually, or appreciated probably is a better way to frame this more recently, is how hard it is just to get there between the coach and the athlete. Never mind other people that we might not trust that much and we don't really know that well, or as John said, we just see as service providers. We'll talk about mindset, I think, later on. All we see is the suit. All we see, you made a great point earlier on about managing upstairs. All we see is people that we need to manage, not necessarily engage. And I'm not saying that lightly, genuinely sort of appreciating that just getting to that level of detail in conversation with the athlete at times is not straightforward. In fact, it probably very rarely is. And I think it's difficult to connect anybody around what matters, whether they're upstairs to the side of you or downstairs, if there's not some semblance of what we are really reaching for. Why are we going there? And again, I'm not going to stand here and try and recite it, but why we are going there clearly matters to you and the athletes, but it's needed for everyone else around you, because it's a different sort of commitment. That point I made earlier on around skin in the game. Right? We cannot persevere in the pursuit of achieving anything great if we don't understand genuinely why it matters. This is from a book called, it'll come to me in a second, I forgot forgotten it, it'll come back to me. It's an art book actually. It's about creation, and essentially the author tells us that this journey to, even if it's just between you and your teams to begin with, should be exciting. It will stimulate us. I appreciate this is a linear model, but I think a bit like the hero's journey, there are some similarities. And at some point, we're going to reach the dark swamp of despair, and that might just be you, the athlete of the team, or between you and the federation, or between you and the performance support team, or parents, or others. But at some point, this journey is going to get tough. And the bridge that speaks across this, which again, there's a lot of popularised culture around grit and purpose work. But fundamentally, are people in at that point? Because you're never going to get the other side to achieving anything great, either you define success, unless there's that level of commitment. And I'm not saying commitment's the same either. I'll tell you this story about not being on the same page around commitment in this, because I felt like I was committed to something. I'm probably doing someone a bit of a favour, and it didn't play out that way because we weren't aligned. So I was working, I was picking up coaching two athletes in lieu of another S&C coach starting a role. It was quite a critical period of time of the programme. This coach, like many coaches, it's their life. It's a big summer, and unfortunately, in that period of time, my great grandmother died. She was 102. So on a Friday, I committed, obviously, to going to the funeral. That was where my commitment needed to be. And I organised, briefed the coach, I organised for somebody else to cover the session that I was covering to senior athletes who were more than capable of doing some lifting. And on my way to my grandmother's funeral, the coach called me and said, "Where are you?" So I'm at my grandmother's funeral. Just literally put it in now. "Yeah, but I need you here. I need you here." And obviously in the moment I was a bit emotional about it, as you can imagine. But in reality and on reflection, I just hadn't had the conversation with him. I hadn't recognised that this period of time really, because of my emotion, was still really, really important to them. And you can feel that in lots of different ways, but having a conversation around what she meant to me, what mattered, why actually I need to prioritise this, not you and the athletes at this period of time, is probably something that I could have done differently, but definitely would have stopped him calling me while I was pulling up at the funeral. So commitment and persistence and belief, I'm not saying are the same, but we're going to need it. And if we don't understand why it matters, what really matters and why we're doing it, then I think that becomes a challenge, or can become a challenge. What will it take to get there? There's a lot being spoken about, starting with these guys over here at BC around what it takes to win, or what will it take to get there. And I think again, what struck me from the conversation this morning, even in podium level performances where we're trying to close the gap on very, very small margins, it's difficult to do this really, really accurately, isn't it? Never mind further down the pathway where what we're reaching for and how we're defining that, I guess, becomes more and more complex. I'm just sharing this with you as a really simple example to just talk to a point more than anything else. This was a critical factors Model 1 preparation for a Rugby World Cup some years ago, and I think 2 points I wanted to make with this. Like if we can't say everything that we know, and we'll come on to that more in a minute, but we probably do need a simple reference point for others to engage on upstairs, downstairs, side to side, that defines to a degree, with certainly a level of commitment, what it is we are prioritising in pursuit of achieving something. Now, I'm not going to get right now into the discussion around how do we know it, because I think that's a conversation we might come to later. But it's really hard to commit to something or understand what is a priority in anything in life, I think, unless you can simply see it. So, regardless of how we got there, for this group, and the language involved in this and what it means, and I've been pulled apart when I showed this before and I shared it to certain colleagues, is actually neither here or there, because it meant something to us. And it was really clear that every day, these were the things we needed to prioritise above everything else. And could at the end of each block or the end of each week, in our staff debrief, talk to where are we at with these things? How do we think these things are going? A general sense check of, is it up, down, what do we think we need to react to next week? And again, I'm not teaching you guys are stuck eggs here just to put something on the table. But sometimes, if I'm honest, and this is one of those things, I think it's a combination between hyper judgment, so that need to be. There's a big difference between critical thinking, being critical of something, and being cynical. And often at times, I think with this type of work, we end up moving to that, is the right or wrong? Is that the right or wrong? Are we really mind that? And I think how the question's framed, who's asking it when they're asking, is critical. But the most important thing I just want to say at this stage is, well, we do need something. We need something that we're reaching for beyond just the aspiration, the objective, or where we're headed. And I appreciate in pathways or where we're dealing with multiple teams or where the sports are more complex or chaotic, this work is different, I'm going to say. I'm going to say it's more difficult. I think sometimes the A to B sports where a lot of the initial conversation like this, it sounds, and of course the actual work is just different. It's just predicted or understood in a different way. But having a reference point for others to engage with around what matters is important. And I guess this will be my final point before I stop and give you guys a bit of time to discuss what I've just shared. Who do we need support from to help us get there? Because defining that is really important as well. There's nothing worse, and I've had this before. You probably picked this up already. I'm quite an emotional guy. I care quite deeply about what I do, and if you ask me for your help and say, I'm in, like I've never met you before, but if you ask me, I'll definitely give you my support. There's nothing worse than wanting to give support and help and not recognising the wrong you did. And that's all right. That's one of my life struggles. That's another story. It's really important. Like, are we really clear about who do we need support from to get there before we even get into how are we going to engage these people? Because that's a really important conversation to have as well. And it's not to say it's for an infinity either. Stu, this is where we're at. This is where we're going. But we just don't need you right now. We'll come back to all that. Do we get to a point where we've defined that moment in time who we need to prioritise and get support from, and have conversations? Not just we'll come on to that with those that are in that bubble, but those that aren't yet, or not now. I'm just putting that out there because I think defining who we need in different layers and different networks around performance, problem solving, dealing with the here and now, coaching. I'm guessing requires, I think, at times that sort of consideration. Who do we need to let go of? Who do we need to say thank you to? Who do we need to shake the hand and say thank you very much? And one of the things, going back to the coaching point I think earlier on, I still think we do sporadically, probably, I'd say, in performance sport, is say thank you and give people good grace and sort of a genuinely good send-off. Not because of our intentions, just because we're moving on to the next thing. But it's so important, isn't it? The experiences that we create sort of in that emotional journey might not mean much to everyone else in the team that's moving forward, but for the person that's left behind, it can be determinant. We certainly feel like it at the moment. Games time, isn't it? It's always the time you see that most in the Olympic Paralympic world, or in the run into every big event. There'll be a group of people that will run up as part of the team right up into the final preparation or prep camp, and they'll be left behind. There'll be a group that leaves at that point. There'll be some that wanted to go, that felt like they should go, that actually wasn't the right time. And often, if I'm honest, we leave those conversations too late. So what happens is, it's the paradox of proximity, isn't it? What happens is everyone's, I had it recently actually in Tokyo. Head of performance sport doesn't travel with the team, made a significant contribution to that effort and that team for a period of time, but for personal reasons decided it wasn't the right thing to do. Gets out, team goes to the games, he stays at home, they have a prolific success. He's had a massive part to play in, and he still can't open the book that the PD sent him to say, thank you for all your efforts. That sort of symbolises their journey. Because I probably as well, didn't get that bit right. We didn't think about the ending. at that point, or that transition point. So without belabouring it too much, like, yeah, defining the people we need, the experiences they might need, because we are going to need those people, I'm sure, at some point. They're still part of our network. We just don't know when. So I'm going to stop there. I'm going to pause for 15 minutes, if that's all right. And I'm going to ask you to get into twos or threes with somebody that you maybe haven't spent much time with, or certainly don't work with. I definitely ask that. And have a conversation about, in part, what I've just shared. It's a view, I'm not saying it's the view. And maybe discuss some of these questions. Like, where do you think, if you were looking at those questions now, like, where do you, in your own practice, inside your own teams or organisations, depending on what level you want to discuss that, like, where do you think you are? Like, if you were looking at those questions now, like, roughly where do you think you are? And I think that sort of frames nicely what we'll come back to next, which is possibilities that I'm going to frame to begin with, more on the challenges that we're seeing consistently crop up when things don't go quite so well. So that's where we're heading, but I think it's a good time just to stop and have a conversation between ourselves. So, are there any questions at this point? Okay. 15 minutes, if we can get together and be ready to for the next section at 10 to. That's all right. Thank you.
I think it's recognition. We recognise all these things that
yeah.
go on within us all the time, and sometimes the book takes us away from the environment we're in, so we want to get support from critical friends that will give us a street, basically, and we'll fluff around with the politics of the sport. I've got a real history of work for people who I would turn to in a minute before doing something structural.
Right, okay.
Sorry, cultural structural.
No. And in terms of that whole space, right, you're saying that that's a benefit, or you want to...
For me, I find it a real benefit. It gets me away from the blanket almost of the approach that we've got to support our sport, and it's looking for. And again, I don't go to other sports, so it's actually out of sport to get that sort of. And we were discussing, we were saying, who you're working with, how you have no idea to say them, but I can ask a stupid question, or I can just say why.
Yeah. And then have a great conversation.
Absolutely, and then you split because you've been given that first recall, and then off you go. Get all that.
I think so. Further than that, it's a link to when you need them as well. So thinking ahead, I think we talked about earlier. Who do I need to support from? When am I likely to do this? And when it's a really intense period here, we're factoring that support, and we'll let those people know I'm going to come to at this point. I think it would be really good planning that we would typically do for athletes. We don't have to do this.
Yes. And then it's really interesting, because I'm not saying this happens all the time, but when that doesn't happen and you do need them and other people haven't prioritised what you need, it creates massive frustration. Like, I do get quite regular conversations on that basis from coaches saying, I just don't see this person enough, or at this time, we needed this, and that's a really important point. Often it might be together. I'm not just saying it's coaches together, we just haven't taken the time to do exactly that. It's really important. Any other thoughts?
We'd like to add another question in. Which is, after what will it take to get there? What do we do once we achieve our goals? How do we end it? What happens next? Because if you haven't planned for it, then things might dissipate and disappear without you realising.
I'll put this in now actually for this reason, because I think, does it ever end in some of the things that John's framed earlier on? Like, every time he talks about the journey where we're at, the hero's journey, how we're framing it, is the short-term or medium-term or long-term goal actually in our lifetime just another significant moment, regardless of the outcome? And I'll put this up for exactly that reason. Like, how far into the future are we, or how far in the distance are we really looking when we're having these conversations? So I think that's, and that point of factoring that in is cyclical, and the cycle of that is going to be an experience for everybody. Is a really important point, I think, really important. Because when we get it right, people leave, don't they, organisations, regardless of, I'm not just saying sport. When people have a meaningful experience together, it's really tough. And you think, how are we going to do this? And then, whether you do it or not, things change again, you might leave. But when you get together for that beer or coffee, it's like, so special, isn't it? Like, we're connected at a different level. And I've definitely worked in teams and organisations where we've done that, either ourselves or the organisations enabled it. And how often do we maybe not think about it if I'm being kind, or don't think it's important actually, which is probably a lot more common. And actually the experience was tough, and we look back at that moment or that effort and think, was it worth it? Yeah, I think that's the way you might plan ahead to consider those cycles and experience. It's a really good point. Any other thoughts?
You should have questions. We had a great conversation. We've got similar challenges in the organisations we're contributing our time to. Both of us with a sort of main employment role, and outside of that, a sort of passion project with volunteers and time and ambition, inherent challenges, management, leadership. As we went through a great conversation on parallel. And you're right, back end it was an inflection point. And we're looking at these questions for an organisation, for a project, for a thing. But there's a shift, and then what about me? You know, where am I going? Why do I want to get there? You know, what would it take for me personally? And so I'd be interested in the room. How many people look to these questions from an organisational perspective? Did anyone look at an individual perspective? So this is me, this is my life, this is my journey. Where am I going? Why is it important? And there was a big shift there, importantly.
Massive. And I would add, thanks very much for sharing that. One of the things I'd add, and this is anecdotal completely, but when these are answers to these questions, or some of these questions, don't align with the organisational team effort, I'm speaking from my own experience. Yeah, there often is pain of some level or frustration. I think that's a really important point. When do you give yourself the time to do it, and who helps you support you in doing it? Because I think even if you just got there between the two of you, prioritising yourselves in the wider effort. And Dean's point earlier on around sustainability just really hit home for me. And I won't get into this now, but I think it's, you know, yourselves, everyone through the coaching pathway, our performance directors as well particularly, sustainability, and I've got that question running through my head in a lot of interactions and conversations in the last year. How, you know, do we support people having those conversations more consistently at that level, a safe space? Really important point. Any other thoughts before we break for coffee? Very good. I think, how long do you want to break for coffee for?
How long you want? 10, 15?
15 minutes.
15 minutes?
Yeah.
So I've got two more areas just to share and hopefully unpack a little bit more. Appreciate we're coming into the last 50 minutes, so I won't rush this, but I think it's important we get to the discussions between ourselves. So I think that's really where the goal is. So the next area when we're talking about working on what matters together consistently, an area I think we could consistently do better in on behalf of athletes and the future is understanding and utilising knowledge differently. And part of that, I think, we were just talking about this, is understanding generally that different types of knowledge are required to build this picture of the future for us to be able to connect with it, whether that be solving specific problems in the here and now, or understanding and defining what we might need to do tomorrow or years down the track. We need different types of knowledge to be able to do that consistently. It's one of the reasons why generally these knowledges exist, right? And other expertise that sit around that. And I think one of the big hooks that always draws me in when John talks about coaching as a craft skill is it's very difficult, isn't it, for a blacksmith or the guy that was making the violins to sort of define everything on a piece of paper in a rudimentary way, what they know, how they do it, when they do it, you know, why he might change a different tool based on the piece of what he has in front of him. Can you please sort of register all this down so we can engage with the plan appropriately, and then we might know when to help you. And I think I use that as an example based on what John shared this morning, but I think it's a fundamental challenge of working together on what matters, because a few layers here at the bottom of the table, in my view. One is we're still evolving from, without me getting on an ideology box, the Industrial Revolution and the mechanisation of knowledge. And we might put that in the science box, maybe, but fundamentally that formation of structure, we can know the known, that's what we need to spend our time on, we can become more efficient and effective, that's where the goal is, the structural aspect of scientific management, as was all those years ago. We're still bound by that, and I'm not saying that's not important, so I'm definitely not standing on the box of sort of, burn down factories, like, that's inhibited our growth as human beings, because clearly it didn't. And a lot of that information and knowledge and expertise we're using for good in our own practice and organisations now. But equally, where are we at with the fact, the things that you've all spoken about over the last couple of days, with the human element here, the human factor, the fact that these things aren't often manageable. They're much more complex and difficult to know. Which sort of probably brings me to the next layer down here, which is, if we're working together on something that matters and genuinely valuing different types of knowledge, probably at the moment, in my sort of simplest form of way I look at this is, are we overvaluing explicit knowledge generally in those conversations and prioritisation and problem solving versus the tacit knowledge, the intangible, the difficult stuff, the craft skills that are innate with us, that are based on our own experience and innate abilities. And that probably creates a large amount of tension at times, or certainly that I see or perceive, between expertise that sit around you as coaches and what needs to be done. Do we value knowledge? Do we value the knowledge that we need on behalf of the athlete and yourselves and others and organisations in the right way? I'm not even going to say in an equal way, because I don't even know if it is equal, but in a way that's representative of the difference that might be needed to move forward in wherever we're trying to get to. Value knowledge. And I'm sure a lot of you have engaged in this work before, but I pulled this quite out from Gary Klein, because I think, again, sort of simple, tangible understanding of decades worth of work from Gary Klein, perhaps perceiving multiple layers, multiple values of knowledge in pursuit of an acceptance that complexity requires lots of different views to give us, as John said earlier on, increasing possibilities. That we need to understand things, have a different view of what's going on, what is or isn't important, and how those things are connected, and that requires us to engage with different types of knowledge on a relatively level footing. And why is that important? Because it might change what we do. It might change how we see the problem, how we choose to overcome the problem, and increased possibilities might give us a better chance of success, fundamentally in the future that we're not entirely sure in terms of what it's going to look like. So I think I pulled these out just as headlines, and as I said, I'm sure a number of you have got on the point of Gary Klein's work, so I certainly don't want to do that in disservice. For me, these are straightforward on the surface. What obstacles through the years has Klein identified as great limiting to different types of knowledge and fundamentally to understanding. The first one, rigid reasoning. And this is maybe where valuing explicit knowledge, the knowns, a level of linearity with our tacit knowledge and understanding becomes a real challenge. Because if you are educated in a way, and through your own experience have been told, this is what performance looks like, this is known and knowable, and you'll be experiencing this, when you come into an environment where that's not the case at all, and reality hits home, and there's a need to be dynamic and think differently or outside the box, and watch and notice and listen and develop relationships. Rigid reasoning can cause, I genuinely believe this from not just a problem-solving perspective, but from that human connection perspective, massive issues. And if we polarise the rigid reasoning, I still hear from time to time, although it's not consistent, the coach doesn't know, or I don't value this person from a coaching perspective. How can we avoid getting to that place? So we have a different conversation together on behalf of performance and the athletes. Passiveness, I guess apathy in our business is never going to achieve very much unless we need downtime on behalf of sustainability and just as a human being. Flawed beliefs. How often do we? I've got a situation at the moment where stories in the coaching office over 10, 15 years have become truth. Have become truth in that training centre. That's how the world is. That's how it exists. Even knowing what they need to overcome to achieve what they all want to achieve with the athletes requires something different than they've done before. But the truth is, your beliefs, we can or can't do these things. This person or organisation is or isn't this. Language as well can become an incredible barrier, I think, in that. Unhelpful design, I think, generally in this phase of what we're talking about here, might be simple things, such simple things, like understanding when we're going to eat, what we're going to talk about. So such simple things, and organisational instructions, I won't go into those, I think they speak for themselves, but how we consider overcoming these obstacles so we engage and value different types of knowledge on behalf of performance so we can work together in a more effective way on what matters is probably something worth considering. And again, from clients' work, empathy appears to be really, really important. A relational activity that requires effort. It doesn't just happen by accident, does it? How do we empathise with each other at a human level so we can have the right conversation? Appreciative inquiry. Do we see what's right in this, or where the possibilities might lie, before we see what's wrong and what can't be done? Appreciative inquiry seems to be an important part of understanding and really mining the knowledge we might need to solve problems in the future. Documented insights is a really interesting one. It's something we're doing a lot of work in at the moment because, again, the known and knowable to a degree are obviously codifiable. You can put them somewhere, they exist. How do we, and we were just talking about this down here, right? How do we document insights in the moment that are anchored in stories and what we experience? So when we come back around to learn from that performance journey or that moment in time, it might not be the whole truth. We're never going to be able to, even the premise we can capture in data, the whole truth in that view of knowledge is clearly not accurate at all. And because it's difficult to capture stories, or there's a perception it's difficult, we might not necessarily always perceive to be that valid because it's tacit-based, it's not objective-based. We might not consider it in our preparing for not just understanding knowledge, but also what we've done and what we might learn from it. So we were talking earlier on about the vignettes and videos from coaching talking heads. Where are we at in this moment? If you were going to describe right now in this moment, how does the plan feel? What's going on? What decisions did or didn't we make? It might be a video, we might write it down. But if we could play that out across time and look back, 6 months later, a year later, to challenge our retrospective adherence based on recency and the outcome, let's be honest, how often did we win or lose, did we get the outcome or not, changes the way we see the past. But it's important, documenting insights on the face of it sounds really dry, but I think there's an opportunity in there, and certainly so we're looking into that a lot. How can we mine and document insights based on our experiences through stories? Engaging design, we talked about earlier on, and I know there's been a lot of discussion on this week around agile working. We've got to accept what we know now might not be, and what we've committed to do now might not be the right thing tomorrow, so we might change it. It's a mindset. It's a mindset that I still see consistently causes massive issues in the dynamic between coach, athlete, and those that need to work around the effort. Even when I said the plan is going to change. I think one of our PDs pointed brilliantly at the start of COVID, so we've got to become world-class experts in pencil packing. Just writing a pencil, be comfortable, tomorrow we're going to have to rub this out. Difficult to do, isn't it, when you've emotionally invested in a really important project that's now not the most important thing. It's dropped off that priority list or what we're going to focus on together. Agile work is a mindset, but it also, I think, needs coaching. It needs coaching to say, you're not the person. The personal commitment to the work is what we value. The work itself might not be the most important thing there. And helping people through that journey. And it might be a very brief conversation, but how often do we hear, through our own lenses, that this isn't important anymore, I've just spent a year of my life committing to this, and actually something's changed. The rules have changed. The athlete cohort's changed. The coaches changed. The plans got to change. But we see ourselves, obviously, in that work, and it becomes really difficult. And it doesn't work, this doesn't work for everybody. I appreciate not everybody sees the world this way. But John used the uncharted planning at the start of the day. And I wonder if, even though sometimes it seems woolly and perhaps unpalatable, that even when we've run a certain path to a certain destination before, if we're running it with different people, it probably isn't the same thing. And so thinking about how we might write the map together consistently through exploration of different knowledge types and experiences is probably something we could bake into our commitment to working together on things that matter. And the last thing I just want to add before I open the floor back up is, generally I'd say, when we get to a good spot in working together on the things that matter, we're still only human and we're really comfortable at focusing on the knowns. And if we're ahead of the curve and we've spent a lot of time developing good performance questions, the unknowns in question format that we need to answer. The challenge I think we've got in working together on the things that matter is this bottom space, because it's about awareness. And if we're going to mine unknown unknowns, we probably need different views and we need diversity. We were talking in the break about, in reality, the world of sport has just been in the street today. I don't know many of you at all, but in one conversation with most of you, I know at least one person that you know directly. Yeah, we are quite a homogenous outfit in elite and performance sport. We might need some difference here. That exploration is going to require some prioritisation. What happens if we don't do this? Well, likelihood is we aren't necessarily going to be able to adapt fast enough, and we're going to be surprised when things change, because we became blinkered to either groupthink or the homogeny that is prevalent. And the last one, unknown knowns. This is about us as individuals. And I do this all the time. I got told off the other day when I walked inside a sport and I used language that they didn't understand, and I wasn't trying to be unhelpful, but I assumed they knew what I was talking about. So how do we sense check in this commitment to work on things that matter together, that we know what we're talking about, we don't assume? Which leads me on to testing assumptions. So one of the other big things practically, I think, from committing to working on things that matter is, when do we bake in testing assumptions? And again, I'll share this with you afterwards, but some questions that I think we come back to consistently is obviously, what do the facts say? We're not saying for a second that tangible, explicit knowledge that's readily available isn't important. Of course it is. It forms a strong part of the evidence base. Heart, head, gut, I think these guys were talking about earlier on. What is our experience telling us? And how do you share that experience? Like, how do you, in the moment with your team, share that experience, and how do the team value that experience? Where does confidence or concern come from? I had a coach tell me not long ago, he always wants to know, where does it come from? Where does the confidence or concern come from the people in his team? And one particular story he told me with one individual, he said, it's great, really insightful, he runs alongside me a lot, particularly around critical decision making at certain times of the year, and he came into the training ground one day and said, just doesn't feel right today. Something's not right. Something's not right. And now he knows to ask him, even though he offers a lot elsewhere, if it's an early morning conversation, he'll ask him, have you had your breakfast? Like, this suggests that you're hungry and a bit grumpy and it doesn't feel quite right. But where does the confidence concern come from? We've got to value experience, insight, wisdom, what we're noticing, but sense checking that might be important. I really like this one. what questions can you ask yourself that might change the way you see this? Giving yourself, I think you did this brilliantly earlier on, with a global conversation with those questions, just reframing, giving yourself time to do that either individually or collectively. I'm not saying everything needs to change all the time, and you're standing on the shoulders of giants based on not just your own experiences, but all the work that goes on into doing everything that you do every day. So what is the payoff if you hold on to that specific view or position? Like, is the evidence for change overwhelming? Are the facts pointing to your experience or everyone else's experience pointing to this needs to change? There's a high level of validity or understanding that confidence is coming from a place that is beyond best guess. So what's the payoff of us holding on to that view? Or are we not sure enough and actually it's so important we need to keep a fixed position? I'm not saying things need to change all the time for no reason. And who might give you a different view, which comes back to that point of the knowns and the unknowns. So who genuinely might give you a different view? And one of the things we are consistently trying to support and facilitate is just connecting different teams, different leaders inside the system to do this, to check and challenge plans. Just to give a different view. Maybe like you said brilliantly earlier on, from a different sport. It was great to hear that. Just where do you think we're at with this? Is there a compelling reason to change this? What do you see the biggest risk being in this effort? And taking the time to do that as a collective, accepting we don't know. We are limited by our own position, our own knowledge, individually and collectively. Again, I think it's a tangible thing that we consider and in our work together. So conscious a little bit of conversation, collaboration fatigue. This will be the last time I ask you to do this, but I think it's important. A conversation for 10 minutes about, based on what I've just shared, what assumptions do you think need to be tested in your environment and how might you go about doing that? And generally curious about how do you currently explore the unknowns in the world? Because I think in performance sport, it will always be a challenge for us to do that for many reasons. Can we learn about how we might do that better together? I think there's an awful lot in that. So 10 minutes, I'll call it back in at 10 to 3. Okay, hopefully that started some more discussion. I won't give us some time at the moment to summarise that because I'm conscious of time and I'm just going to use the last 15 minutes to land this first piece and hopefully we can carry the conversation on into the coffee break afterwards. The final thing I just want to talk to you guys about briefly is when we talk about working together on the things that matter, and we talked about this earlier, so we often talk about alignment. And when I take us back to the importance of being aligned through a perhaps scientific management lens or a lens where it's controllable, knowable, doable, and consistent, we often have issues because the reality is, again, without me going back over everything, it's complex, it's dynamic, performances change all the time, it's difficult work, people are involved. But alignment isn't wrong, and I used to wrestle with this a lot. And share my opinion with a number of colleagues until one of them, Dr. Kate Hayes, said to me, Stu, maybe we've just got to see it, that alignment is actually a consistent outcome of lots of other things. Can we just frame it that way? And perhaps the biggest thing that helps us in consistent alignment, connectivity, in this dynamic, ever-changing, uncertain effort with lots and lots of different people involved is coherence. That's all got me thinking, well, what do we mean by coherence? We've been looking into that a little more. And this is a framework and model. Again, I'm not saying it's telling the whole story of what coherence is, but I think when we talk about working together on the things that matter in performance, it makes a lot of sense to me, so I thought I'd share it with you. Probably the first thing we often miss, and we talked about this a lot across the whole day, is that coherence probably starts and ends with meaning. I really like the thought that, and John and the guys talked about this again this morning, that if it doesn't feel meaningful to us internally, if the question you asked earlier on around you can't answer some of those questions yourself, is it really coherent? You know, on average, do I feel fulfilled about the commitment and the effort, regardless of how difficult it is? Do I close the door at night and think, that was a tough day, but the hustle's on, like we're moving forward? Or do I feel like I'm not sure this is worth it anymore? Is that limiting our ability to be coherent? Where's the learning line? I think, again, it's spoken about this morning, the balance between challenge and support. We talk about that a lot, but can it be meaningful if learning's really not in the middle of it? And therefore, can it ever really be that coherent? And satisfaction, without unpacking that, I think a lot of people have different views on joy, happiness, etc. I know satisfaction probably sounds a bit unambitious in the middle of the road, but it's certainly not distressful from a satisfaction perspective if we're reaching some form of coherence. Maybe the next thing we need to consider in this is it comprehensive? So, is there a level, even though we accept there's a high level of uncertainty and a need to explore unknowns and unknown knowns consistently, actually we need a level of predictability to be coherent consistently so we can adapt, so we can stay connected, so we can be aligned. And if we're not, what happens? That's probably where, broadly speaking, the human element of malalignment plays out before anything else, because we haven't spoken for 3 months and I didn't know that was going on. And through no one's ill intention, we just didn't know when we were going to speak next. So when are we going to organise the key aspects of connection so we stay coherent based on the here and now, what's important? And probably the most important piece in comprehension is shared understanding. Going back to what we touched on before around insights, that the knowledge we need to keep solving problems and staying aligned is ever evolving. You've got to be able to build and share knowledge consistently, and that requires probably a different skill set, a different environment at times, a different climate for us to pursue alignment. And finally, is it manageable? Do the resources, people, money, facilities, etc., time, do the resources support our aspirations? And I know in all sport, or generally in all sport, that would be a challenge through the pathways. I think John was absolutely right earlier on when he said, it's consistent with one of the first things that gets cut consistently when the top gets cut is we start at the bottom. And I won't stand on my soapbox about that now, and I'm definitely not trying to open that box as part of this discussion, but part of that, I guess, is acceptable viewing the manageability of our resources so things are coherent and achievable in a practical and pragmatic way. Can we be coherent consistently? So again, these are more take-home questions, but I just thought I'd land them with you. Some might or might not be relevant or of interest, but from creating a meaning perspective, making sure from a coherence perspective we're considering meaning, being meaningful in our work. What will keep us emotionally connected to what we're trying to achieve? What would happen if we asked the people we need when we define them what that looks like? What would you decide as senior leaders or coaches within your teams that actually if we started with that, to be coherent we need to be emotionally connected, what might we do? I'm not saying it would work all the time or be right for everybody, but taking the time to ask the question. Do we know what we need to learn and get better at? I say it so many times, and I'm laughing because I'm still learning how to do it better myself, but one of the things we're still not really great at sometimes in teams for lots of different reasons is just giving feedback. We just need to get, what do we really learn from? We just need to get better at this. I know you guys do it with athletes, I'm sure you do it with certain members of the team all the time, but actually, can we get to a point where we're really explicit about, as a group, this is what we need to learn and get better at? We were talking about Chris Spice, who's performance director of swimming earlier on. It's unbelievable at creating the infrastructure, the thinking, the prioritisation around answering that question consistently of everyone in the environment. And what do we see? What do we see in the, I think this is again, it's human nature, but how often do we get together because we're under pressure with the people who matter, we get together, the agenda's set, and the agenda is about what we need to get done and what we're doing. Human doing. So we've got, and again, I'm going back to the structure and the people bit. I'm not saying we don't need to do that. I'm not saying we don't need accountability. I'm not saying we don't need to track progress. But on balance, how much time do we spend prioritising that when we get together? in a meaningful way. If we saw human beings and the effort we might need to prioritise that 10, 15% more in the time we spend together, would it make a difference to meaningful coherence? And this is definitely reciprocal. And this is something that Bill Bezic, a very experienced sports psychologist, comes back to me with all the time, is in the end, this is about feeling valued, appreciated, understood, and listened to. And it's a two-way street. In preparation for our strategy for this cycle, we asked a number of coaches, how do you want to feel working with your teams moving forward? What does or doesn't work? Where can things get better? And the consistent thing that came up is we just want to be understood. We'll be understood. One very experienced, successful Olympic coach who doesn't hold back, and he has gone through probably quite an extensive formal education, said, every time the sports science medicine team call a meeting, I think to myself, what have I done wrong now? How would it be nice if I didn't feel like that, I didn't feel stupid? Now, again, I'm not saying trying to polarise this, but can we move to a place where we spend time valuing, appreciating, understanding, feel like we're listened to, within the collective, the same on the other side. How often do I know so often that from a practitioner perspective, things get frustrating because I just couldn't get time with the coach. Got this really important thing to tell them that I think is really, I'm not sure it's important what I want to tell them, I just can't get to it, I can't get into it. And I'm not saying that's practically possible all the time, but can we enable it in a different way so that we maintain a level of meaningful coherence? In comprehensiveness, I think these are probably things consistently we should be considering. As I said, how do we plan to communicate regularly so we can think together? The organisation of that activity will need to be different. Probably haven't got time to go into that now, but the thinking around how we're going to think together on things we need to think about. Like it takes planning, it takes some consideration. I don't think it needs to be complicated, but it's got to be prioritised. And how do we create environmental structure for knowledge sharing and building? I think part of that is, whilst I'm being slightly, challenging in the statement, is if we assume we don't have all the answers to what we need to do, and there's a level of openness on certain things and what we do and don't know, that's a great opportunity for us to consider how we share and build knowledge on behalf of the athlete performance. And do we understand how critical decisions will be made? This fascinates me. This still, again, I'm going to speak from my own experience, but still people get annoyed about why was I involved in that decision about athlete selection or the final strategy sign-off or the plan. Well, it's because the clue in the words that it's support. We're there to support. Critical member of the team. Some members of that team will be consulted more than others, but I think what's important about that is, do we understand how they're going to be made? Am I asking your opinion as a coach, practitioner A, because I need to understand more and I'm going to be the final decision maker, or are we making this decision together? Do we contract, I know we talked about earlier on, do we contract it in? Are we really clear on the plan around when those critical decisions are going to have to be made and who's going to be involved and who's not? And that's not to say, again, people shouldn't be listened to or have opportunity to input, but again, I just see it consistently when we talk about working together on things that matter. It creates such frustration and, in the end, in the worst case, disengagement. The final thing I'm going to leave you with is are things manageable from a coherence perspective? And I think one of our directors talks about this an awful lot, is where do we start the conversation? Do we start the conversation with the resource we've got, based on where we're trying to get to, this is what we've been given, work back to define what we need to do based on that resource, or cut our cloth accordingly, and then we'll figure out what the opportunities are? Or do we start it the other way around? Do we maintain an aspirational stance around the opportunity and mine it for what it could be and what we might be able to achieve? Then do we define the need? and then do we understand what that means from a resource perspective? And I appreciate practically, that's always going to be a challenge regardless of where we sit or what organisation we're in. But I think it's an interesting challenge. Is it disabling to the point where there's the resources there, where there's no opportunity and therefore the need can't be met? You know, how we frame that thinking together, the stories we tell ourselves actually. We went through, for the first time, probably 25, 6 years. You know, I think you've probably seen that most programmes in the British system that have been funded consistently had a haircut to some degree financially, and the response to that was really interesting to observe from the CIC. The mindset towards it, and not that, of course, difficult decisions had to be made, etc. But there is definitely a difference in framing it as an opportunity. The aspiration remains the same. Can we redefine the need and genuinely consider the resources that we might need to be able to do that, rather than we just need more? What does it need to fulfil the opportunity to more? It's because that's probably at the end, one, it's not realistic, two, it's not that healthy. Or are we in the mindset of, we can't do it because? And what's that really telling us about the goals we're trying to achieve? So that's probably more of the manageable one, it's probably more of a bit of a sense check on the work we're doing collectively and the stories we're telling ourselves around the resource we've got and where we're starting and finishing that conversation. So this is my last slide. Hopefully some of that's been useful. The last question I normally ask when in these sort of sessions is, when I get given this platform, you probably realise this already, I get quite excited. I spend ages thinking about what I'm going to talk about. I just can't get it all down. I'm sorry. I just can't prioritise, ironically. So I hope some of that's been useful, but I guess in the end, what would be great if there was one thing, one small thing, that you could do that might make the biggest difference in this whole effort of learning to work together. Then I'd really encourage you over the next 15 minutes or so during coffee break, even if it's a conversation, or to write it down. Like, what's resonated with you? What do you think you could go after? Often these things don't ever start with massive things if they are great, but what's the smallest thing you might be able to do that will make the biggest difference in working together on the things that matter in your own worlds? That's it for me, Sergio. Thank you very much.